Okay, so welcome to our first discussion of statistics. This is our introduction to chapter 1. And the first thing that I want to kind of highlight is that research is a tool. It's not necessarily a skill set. It's not an ability to be mastered. It's a tool. And it's a tool to answer questions or to solve problems. So research is used to ask questions or to solve problems like, how do we improve job satisfaction? Is there a problem with job satisfaction? What predicts employee turnover? How effective is probation at preventing recidivism? All of these are applied questions that are asked with the use of research. And in research, we use something called hypothesis testing, and this is just a very basic way of asking questions. So we gather data from samples, and then we ask questions from the participants in our samples, and then we generate statistics to answer questions about that sample, and then generalize those to the larger population. Now, the nature of research, we're going to talk about a few types of research. The experiment is more of a very tightly controlled approach to a situation. An experiment usually has an experimental group and a control group. And for example, a research question that it would be experimental would be, does an authoritarian leadership style affect employee morale? If you can randomly assign certain employees to an authoritarian leader and other employees to a more kind of laissez-faire leader, and then compare their morale, then you can test for differences. And to the extent to which those groups then differ in their morale, we can talk about whether or not that difference was caused by the leadership style. So an experiment is usually done in a tightly controlled environment. We have control over the independent variable, and we look for differences across groups because of that independent variable. Loosening things up a bit, we can go to the survey. This is more retrospective. It lacks control, so we can just develop a bunch of questions to ask and send that out to our participants. It has a lot of advantages. We can capture a large amount of people. We can collect data relatively quickly, especially with online surveys these days. And in the case of our employee morale example, we can very easily survey all company employees about their morale. Whereas if we wanted to use an experiment, it would take a lot of resources and a lot of time to actually conduct a controlled study looking at the different effects of leadership style. So if we wanted to do something cheaper and much easier, we could do a survey and then gather data that way. Now, content analysis is usually seeking to describe the content of previously produced messages. So these are things like asking someone a question, like to stick with the employee example, what affects your morale? Is a good question. And we might also ask people to describe what is good working conditions. The nice thing about content analysis is that it forces us to kind of lay our assumptions down and start to build how we understand these constructs like good working conditions or employee morale in the language of the kind of units that we're surveying. So this is a good way to look kind of from the ground up at what good working conditions are, rather than developing questions about good working conditions and asking participants to agree or disagree with them. Participant observation is another option that we have. This might be you go into an office building or you go into an assembly line and you're just observing employees to assess their morale. Problems with this are a lot of times people, if they know they're being watched, will behave differently. So there's always something to consider there. Now, meta-analysis lets us look at the combination of the results of lots of studies. So we might look at 200 studies that looks at what impacts employee morale. And if we can combine all of those studies together statistically and then take a look all together, we have a much stronger case for our argument that yes, leadership style is going to affect employee morale. So a meta-analysis allows us to answer questions like, if we look at all of the research all together, what has the greatest impact on employee morale? Or from a criminal justice perspective, if we do the same thing, if we look at lots of previously conducted studies, we can look to see across all of those, what is the most common predictor of recidivism? What's the largest predictor of recidivism, etc. Whereas if we look at just one study, we're kind of limited in our ability to look beyond that one study. And then finally, there's secondary analysis, which allows us to analyze already existing data sets. So lots and lots of options here. Let me show you these options of secondary data. These are the various websites that include this kinds of data. This is public access data. And you can see that, so example, let's look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS. This includes data about crime offenders, victims that are in the justice system, and then the URL is listed there. So this allows researchers to analyze a large variety of already existing data and prevents the need for the data collection of new data.